Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And we're going to start here by citing a basic fact. It's not a topic I've covered before, but still a basic fact that should be noted. Treatment for gender dysphoria, that is, gender-affirming treatment in healthcare, has been deemed medically appropriate by literally dozens of health-related organizations, including every major pediatric organization in the United States. This includes the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Psychological Association, the National Association of Social Workers, the Pediatric Endocrine Society, the Society for Adolescent Health and Medicine, and more than a dozen others. Despite that, despite using the same sort of, showing the same sort of devotion to facts and logic that enabled them to declare COVID being just the flu and to actually encourage infections by opposing mask mandates. And by the way, the current death total from COVID is now approaching 1.1 million. So despite this, Goppers and other assorted proto-fascists have over the past few years directed levels of viciousness toward transgender youth that are nothing short of barbaric. And it's gone from sneering to attacks about school sports to witch hunts about grooming among schools and school boards to have reached levels of outright eliminationism. Gender-affirming care is banned in Arizona and in Arkansas. Gender-affirming surgery for minors is a felony in Alabama. In Texas, state agencies are required to consider gender-affirming health care to be child abuse, and anyone who provides it or assists someone in obtaining it to be a suspected abuser. A bill passed the Idaho House to sentence healthcare providers offering gender-affirming care to life in prison. Now note that some of those provisions that I cited and some others in other states have either sometimes not passed, and some of them have been blocked by courts, so they're not in effect just yet. But that can't deny either the reach, the intensity, or the intent of the effort, marked perhaps most clearly by South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, who celebrated the passage of an anti-trans school sports bill by directly comparing support for transgender rights to terrorism. Meanwhile, in Congress, 50 House Goppers, led by QAnon butt kisser Marjorie Taylor Greene, the brainiac who thinks that solar power, she's against solar power because she thinks it doesn't work at night. They're pushing a bill to outlaw gender-affirming care for youth nationwide. It would include a ban on any federal money for any form of such care. It would require banning any coverage for such care under the Affordable Care Act. It would even require institutions of higher education not to offer any training on gender-affirming care, and accrediting agencies to refuse to accredit any agency or organization that provides such care. Criminal penalties can range up to 25 years in the federal slammer. But that's not enough for you. There's still more. On October 13th, a group of Michigan Gopper state representatives went all the way. They introduced a bill that would see parents and healthcare professionals facing the threat of 25 years to life in prison for providing gender-affirming care. The bill would change the very definition of child abuse to explicitly include anyone who, quoting, knowingly or intentionally consents to, obtains, or assists with a gender transition procedure for a child, where procedure is specifically defined to include not only gender-affirming surgery, which is actually quite rare among teens, but it would also apply to hormone treatments and puberty blockers, even though such treatments are both harmless and completely reversible. You decide at some point you don't want to transition, you just stop taking the medications and your body takes care of the rest. Goppers are the majority in the Michigan House, and they're expected to throw their full support behind the bill. The only sort of good news here being that if it passes both the House and the Senate, which is state Senate's also controlled by the Goppers. But Governor Gretchen Whitmer would probably veto it, assuming, that is, she survives the dark money-funded electoral assault from Gopper and all-around definition of right-wing fakery Tudor Dixon. But that's not the worst part of this bill. We haven't even gotten to the worst part of it yet. The bill goes beyond what I've said before. It not only bars the provision of any new treatment, it mandates that trans teens receiving treatment in the state are forced to stop their gender-affirming care and, in fact, undergo compulsory medical detransition. This is outright eliminationism. This is saying to trans youth, you are not allowed to be that way. We're going to force you to not be that way. You have no right to exist. This at a time when the Trevor Project's 2022 survey on the mental health of LGBTQ+ youth determined that more than 60% of them say their mental health has deteriorated as the result of these sort of attacks over the past couple of years. Nearly 1 in 5 transgender and non-binary youth attempted suicide in the past year. 42% of youth who identified as LGBTQ+ contemplated suicide, a figure that rose to 52%, a majority for trans kids in particular. And every one of those figures is worse for LGBTQ+ youth of color. These laws, despite all their screeching about protect the children, are going to see children die. And you know, it's always about, the children. Think of the children. That's what this sort of moral panic always seems to in some way be about, the children. From the Salem witch trials right up through the panics in my lifetime about comic books, about rock and roll, daycare centers, Dungeons and Dragons, video games, the internet. It always keeps being about, oh my God, the children. But there is a difference in this case. There is a difference here. Most moral panics seem to emerge sort of organically. Somehow a few people get an idea about something, it gets talked about, so a few more hear about it. And for some reason, invariably related to broader social fears and stresses, that somehow it catches on and it grows by feeding on itself in a feedback loop until at some point it burns itself out. Not this one. There's nothing natural or organic about this one. This current anti-trans panic has been manufactured consciously and deliberately, top-down, deliberately created by right-wing and repressive forces and their associated think tanks to create fear and then to exploit that fear purely for their own extremist self-interest. As noted by David Nywert, who has looked at this and been following the topic, that is the topic of eliminationist rhetoric, the rhetoric that says you don't have a right to exist or you don't have a right to be here. He's been following this topic, the use of such rhetoric as a political weapon, for years. And he says the entire point of such rhetoric is to create permission to direct violence freely at the targeted minority group. Or as in this case, the targeted minority group plus anyone in the general vicinity, such as supportive teachers, supportive parents, and supportive healthcare professionals, and more recently, performers at drag shows that are reading to children, who are all of them either groomers or outright pedophiles or pedophile predators or all three, or in the latter case, also perverts. And do not think for an instant that the overt physical intimidation directed at those drag shows by such as the Proud Boys, whose pride consists of being right-wing thugs, don't think for a minute that that kind of physical intimidation is not directly related to this eliminationism. For evidence that all this is deliberate, a deliberate creation, we can look to a report from August out of the Human Rights Campaign and the Center for Countering Digital Hate, looking at the increasing anti-LGBTQ hate rhetoric on social media. And by the way, thanks to David Nywert for the link to the study and for some of the other background here. These groups looked at tweets containing slurs like groomers or pedophiles in the context of conversations about LGBTQ+ people in the period from January to July 2022. There were nearly 990,000 such tweets, plus an additional 130,000 plus using the dismissive smear OK Groomer. One key finding here was that after Florida Governor Ron DeSantis got his Don't Say Gay bill through, the rate of hateful tweets quadrupled, more than quadrupled. And this is because I would say that the bill's passage was felt somehow to legitimize the bigotry. More significant, however, is the finding in this study that much of the hate is being generated by a handful of well-known right-wing influencers. The researchers looked at the 500 most viewed hateful grooming tweets. They discovered those 500 tweets have been viewed an estimated 72 million times, and that 2/3 of that total, 48 million views, came from the tweets of just 10 people. The top 4 of this list contain no surprises. I mean, there was Marjorie Taylor, color of nausea green; James Lindsay, an anti-woke activist who described the pride flag as that of a hostile enemy; Lauren Pistol-Packin' Mama Boebert; and Chaya Raichik, the sniggering clown behind the Libs of TikTok account. Among the rest of the 10, we find such as Ron DeSantis' press secretary, one Christina Shaw, who pulled right out of the language of QAnon, the business about groomer in order to take that crap mainstream. We find 2 pundits for the far-right outfit Turning Point USA. We find one from Blaze TV, which is actually where you go if you want to find out whatever the hell happened to Glenn Beck. And one from the Daily Wire, the reactionary news outlet founded by poster boy for privilege and winner of the Erickson Report's Clown of the Year Award for 2020, Ben Shapiro. In other words, a pretty standard collection of right-wing grifters, greedheads, and gas bags, backed by the usual band of bullshitters like the outfits at Faux News, which ran a series of shows on pedophilia in March and April, which included a guest on Fox and Friends claiming children were, quote, being ripened for grooming for sexual abuse by adults, and another on America Reports insisting that affirmative care for trans children goes beyond predatory grooming into psychological torture. And the fact is, reactionary groups and movements like Christian nationalists, including fundamentalist preachers demanding that gay people be lined up against the wall and shot in the head, and neo-fascist white power groups like Patriot Front, all of these groups with their individual ranges of ideological fixations, they've banded together to wield groomer rhetoric like a bludgeon for one purpose and one purpose only. As put by Justin Unga, Human Rights Campaign Director of Strategic Initiatives, it's for pure politics. Adding that it's no coincidence that people have inflamed and used this rhetoric during the period of primary elections. They are, he said, inflaming the most extreme elements of their fan base to gain notoriety, to build a brand they say is politically and financially profitable. In other words, this is all about what the right wing is always about: greed, selfishness, egotism, and power hunger. These people don't give a single flying damn about the children they claim to be protecting. They don't care about the bullying, about the harassment, about the violence, about the suicides. They don't care about the prospect of children being ripped from supportive parents precisely because of that support. Remember, in Texas and in some other states, that's child abuse. They don't care about the increase in hate crimes directed against gender nonconforming people. They simply do not care. Because for them, these children, they're not really children. They're cartoons, they're cardboard cutouts, they're stage props to be named, labeled, and moved around however they think will produce the desired effect in the audience. The realities of the lives of these children don't move them. The realities of the deaths of these children move them even less. It's all about the posturing, the pose, the play. If Diogenes were to move among these people, I expect he would be extremely lonely and extremely disappointed. They are, in a word, despicable. And we're taking a break. And we are back. And we're back actually with a footnote about something I just talked about the topic about trans rights. There's actually one more reason beyond present-day political ideological gain why trans folks, particularly trans youth, are the current target of choice for the bigots and the fearmongers, which is that they fear long-term loss. 2019, according to a report from the Public Religion Research Institute, more than 6 in 10 Americans said that at the time they had become more supportive toward transgender rights over the preceding 5 years. An increase in tolerance across that time was reported by people across all age ranges, all religious group surveys, and almost all political groupings, with only conservative goppers saying otherwise. Now note that that does not mean that majorities supported trans rights, but the trend was clearly in that direction. And there is good reason to think that as public awareness of and therefore more familiarity with trans people has in fact grown since, there's reason to think that that trend has continued. Okay, back in 2004, there was a whole spate of state constitutional amendments enacted to ban same-sex marriage. It was the same sort of situation. Support for same-sex marriage was increasing, and the reactionaries wanted to block progress. It's the same here, same as it ever was. The reactionaries are losing. They are losing in long term. They know they're losing. They know that at some point the train of history is just going to run right over them, and they're standing, as William Buckley famous put it, they're standing athwart history shouting, "Stop." It was another 11 years from 2004, but ultimately the right wing failed in the case of same-sex marriage, even as they still fight rearguard actions against it, like the baker who a court recently said can refuse to bake a cake for a same-sex couple because, you know, God and stuff. But even so, even as those people still win a few legal victories, they've lost in the court of public perception. Long term, they have lost. And in the long run, they will fail with regard to trans folks too. Keep hope alive. All right, next up, the letter. So on October 24th, 30 members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus sent a letter to the White House that in effect suggested trying to open a conversation with Russia about a potential settlement, diplomatic end to its war against Ukraine. The result was what Politico called a firestorm of hostile reaction, one fueled to no small degree by how the Washington Post described the letter as one urging President Biden to dramatically shift his strategy on the Ukraine war, calling it a break with official policy and a rupture in the party. The reaction was swift enough and hostile enough that by that same evening, Caucus Chair Pramila Jayapal was issuing a clarification, and by the next day, it had been withdrawn altogether. But this letter was not a break with policy. It wasn't. In fact, the letter was quite anodyne. It included praise for Biden and reasserting support for him and insisting that no agreement can be reached without the support of Ukraine. So what got it in so much trouble? When you come right down to it, it was this passage, quoting, "If there is a way to end the war while preserving a free and independent Ukraine, it is America's responsibility to pursue every diplomatic avenue to support such a solution that is acceptable to the people of Ukraine. The alternative to diplomacy is protracted war with both its attendant certainties and catastrophic and unknowable risks." In other words, as The Intercept put it, the letter was met, quoting The Intercept, that the letter was met with such fierce opposition is a measure of the space available for debate among congressional Democrats when it comes to support for the war and how it might be stopped before it turns nuclear. Roughly zero. So invested have the Democratic hierarchy, and particularly its hack sycophants, become, so invested have they become in the glories of war and the shimmering image of an outright military defeat of Russia, that simply proposing the idea of talking about the possibility of a settlement is beyond the pale. Indeed, it often seems those hack sycophants are more interested in decisive victory through overwhelming force than that hierarchy is. And bluntly, frankly, I believe it's because a lot of them see such a victory as a proper retribution for Russia, for Russia's having in their minds been single-handedly responsible for inflicting Tweety Pie on us. Among the worst of these hack sycophants is Markos Moulitsas, founder of Daily Kos. He's someone who's fond of calling people tankies, which is a 1950s-era anti-communist smear, accusing people of maintaining blind support for the Soviet Union even after its invasion of Hungary in 1954. Referring now to the letter, Markos charges the signers, quoting him, are now making common cause with Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, J.D. Vance, and the rest of the MAGA crowd. Which Ukrainians of these progressives want abandoned to mass murder and rape in their attempt to prop up a flailing Russia? Thus, in one statement, accusing them both of lining up with the worst of the goppers and of being on Russia's side in the war, accusing them of aiding the enemy, both domestic and foreign. But there's another point here, and that's that part of the reason for the firestorm is not what was said, but who said it. That at least part of the response was the desire of the party hierarchy to smack down party progressives who have been gaining influence over time. The letter, in fact, noted that Blodin himself has echoed some of what it said, having repeatedly expressed that only negotiations can ultimately end the conflict, that nuclear war is more imminent now than it has been at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that he's worried about the fact that Putin, quoting Biden, doesn't have a way out right now, and I'm trying to figure out what we do about that. What's more, on October 15th, St. Barack said during an interview on the podcast Pod Save America that he is concerned about the fact that, quoting him, lines of communication between the White House and the Kremlin are probably as weak as they have been in a very long time. Even in some of the lowest points of the Cold War, there was still a sense of the ability to pick up a phone and work through diplomatic channels to send clear signals. And precisely because, he said, Putin has so centralized decision-making, quoting again, us finding ways in which some of that communication can be reestablished would be important. Which is hardly different from what the letter said, just without the specific reference to Ukraine. Meanwhile, just over a week earlier, retired Admiral Mike Mullen, the former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said during an appearance on the ABC show This Week that the possibility that Russia might use battlefield nuclear weapons, quoting, speaks to the need to do everything we possibly can to try to get to the table to resolve this thing. He actually added that he thinks it's up to Secretary of State Blinken and other diplomats, quoting again, to figure out a way to get both Zelensky and Putin to the table. A statement which in some ways goes beyond what the letter said. Even former U.S. Ambassador to Russia Michael McFaul, who was one of Obama's key advisors and is a strong supporter of Ukraine, said he agreed with the idea of making the effort. He just doubted it would get very far. None of those statements from Biden, from Obama, from Mullen, from McFaul produced anything like the reaction here. In fact, they hardly produced any reaction at all beyond some tut-tutting that Biden may have overstated the probability of Putin actually going nuclear. But no matter, none of that matters, because in this case, it was the Congressional Progressive Caucus that said it, and it needed to be smacked down. So effective was that smackdown, so complete the capitulation, that not only was the letter withdrawn, the announcement of the withdrawal included the statement, every war ends with diplomacy, and this one will too, after Ukrainian victory. And the hierarchy smiles, and the hack sycophants go out to sussing out any hint of dissent. Finally on this, something not directly related to the letter or the reaction to it, but it is related to Ukraine, and so it's worthy of noting. Note that Biden said he's worried that Putin doesn't have a way out. Well, a legitimate question is, once Ukraine didn't collapse immediately upon the invasion, did they want Putin to have a way out? First, never forget that the U.S. alone has to date given Ukraine $17.5 billion in direct military aid. Now, you can argue every penny of that is justified, but the point here is that we cannot say we are passive observers. We are directly involved. The U.S. and the rest of NATO are directly involved. This is not a war of Russia against Ukraine. This is a proxy war of Russia versus NATO, with Ukraine just being the battleground in which it's being fought. All right, with that in mind, recall that back in mid-March, as I noted at the time, there were some negotiations going on between Ukrainian and Russian officials with some expressions of optimism by both sides. Not that a settlement was imminent, but they were making some progress toward one. Then on April 9th, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson made a surprise visit to Kyiv, where, according to the Ukrainian news outlet, Ukrainska Pravda, he brought two simple messages to the capital. One, Putin's a war criminal. He should be pressured, not negotiated with. And two, even if Ukraine is ready to sign some agreements with Putin, NATO isn't. 3 days later, Putin said negotiations were at a dead end. Now, maybe that timing was just coincidence. Okay, maybe it was. But the fact that Zelensky also lost all interest in negotiations right around the same time gives a rather obvious interpretation some weight. An interpretation bolstered by the fact that at the same time, this is the first week of April, the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft was saying that, quoting, there are several lines of evidence that suggest that the U.S. is inhibiting a diplomatic solution in Ukraine, including significantly the U.S.'s total absence from those March negotiations, their total apparent disinterest in giving them no support whatsoever. Now, I have to emphasize, it is not certain. It's certainly not certain that the conclusion that this points to is true, but there is reasonable cause to believe it. A conclusion that creates not the image of the U.S. and the NATO causing the war, but of one of the U.S. and NATO allowing it to continue for the purpose of pressuring Putin. And the difference between those two things, I frankly would call the distinction without a difference, because it surely makes no difference at all to the homeless, the refugees, and the dead. So we don't know if this idea is true, if this conclusion is true. And in fact, we have to hope that it's not true, because it would be quite heinous if it is. Then again, war often is. All right, I'm just about done here. Just one last thing I wanted to mention. Election Day is coming up. I'm doing this, not long before Election Day. Please go vote, and don't ignore the down ballot questions. There are a lot of things like Secretary of State and whatnot in various places where election deniers are trying to get in place where they can be in charge of the elections. Don't let that happen, okay? Go vote. For me, I will see you in 2 weeks after the election with probably more bad news, but for now, peace.